Good evening. Can you hear me? Great. So good evening. My name is Duncan White, and I have the honour of welcoming you to Writers Speak, the Mahindra Humanities Centre series, which invites distinguished writers to campus with the intention of fostering literary conversation. This is the first Writers Speak event of the spring semester. That does not feel very spring-like out there today, so thank you for braving the cold. Your endeavour will be well rewarded. We have a terrific conversation lined up for you tonight. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Anuk Arudpragasam in conversation with Tara Menon. Anuk is the author of two novels. His first, The Story of a Brief Marriage, published in 2016, won the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature and was shortlisted for the Dylan-Thomas Prize and the Internationale Literatur Prize. His second novel, A Passage North, published in 2021, was shortlisted for the Booker Prize, the Dylan-Thomas Prize again, and the George Orwell Prize. He is currently working on a third novel set in the Tamil diaspora. Anuk was born in Colombo to Tamil parents and attended Stanford University as an undergraduate before earning a doctorate in philosophy from Columbia University in 2019. Alongside his scholarship and fiction writing, he is an accomplished narrator. Both of Anuk's novels are set in the aftermath of the Sri Lankan Civil War and are concerned with the intersections of history, Tamil identity, and trauma. The novels grapple with big philosophical and historical ideas and do so through stories of love, desire, grief, and loss in prose dedicated to a lyrical evocation of the everyday world. One perceptive critic, reviewing A Passage North in the New York Times, wrote the following, and I quote, "In sentences of unusual beauty and clarity, Arudpragasam observes even the most mundane of actions, smoking a cigarette, waiting for a train, making eye contact with a stranger, with an attention so absolute it feels devotional. He is equally gifted at atmospheric sensory description that transports the reader to Sri Lanka and India and at examining the emotions, elation, fear, impatience, satisfaction, shame, that simmer below the surface of our everyday lives." That critic was Tara Menon. Tara, as many of you know, is Assistant Professor of English here at Harvard University. Her first academic book, Speaking Parts, Character Conversation, and Social Worlds in 19th-Century British Novels, will be published in September by Princeton University Press. Her reviews and essays have appeared in venues including the New York Times Book Review, Los Angeles Review of Books, Public Books, the Sewanee Review, Bookforum, and The Nation. As well as being an accomplished literary critic, Tara is also a novelist. Her debut, Underwater, will be published in March by Riverhead in the US and Summit in the UK. Rights have also been sold in 33 other countries. Okay, before starting, please can I ask you to put your phones on mute? There will be opportunities for audience questions after the conversation has sort of developed for a little bit. If you have a question, put your hand up. We will have a mic, and we'll get that mic round to you. It's kind of important for the recording and so that everybody can hear what your insightful question is. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Anuk and Tara.
Thank you very much, Duncan. Sazi, can you see and hear me? Great. Okay, so I'll tell you the sort of run of play for today. We're going to talk about Anuk's novels in order. So we'll start with The Story of a Brief Marriage. We'll get to A Passage North. We'll break at about 6:40 for Anuk to read from his new third novel, as yet untitled, as far as I understand. And then we'll stop at about 7 for questions. So that's the plan. I wanted to start, if you'll indulge me, by telling you about how I encountered Anuk's work for the first time, which was I was a graduate student in New York at NYU, and I had a routine, which is when I got off the train, I would go to this bookstore in the West Village called Three Lives, and the booksellers would recommend a book to me. And my rule was I had to finish the book before I bought another one, as some sort of way of limiting the books. And I went in one day, and the bookseller said to me, "This is the best book of the year." I hadn't heard of it. And I got it. And from that day in 2016 until today, when people ask me which contemporary novels should I read, I have a list of 5, and A Story of Brief Marriage is one of those 5, usually the first. I haven't told any, I met Anuk today earlier, but I didn't tell him all of this. I think it's just an exquisitely beautiful, extraordinary novel. So if you do one thing today, you should go home and buy a copy of The Story of Brief Marriage. But then I did something which now I do first, but I didn't do first. I read the back. And to my great dismay, I read the line, Anuk Arudpragasam is from Colombo, Sri Lanka, and he's currently completing a dissertation at Columbia University. And I thought, how is he also doing a PhD? And then I discovered that this PhD was in philosophy. And so the first question I wanted to ask, as somebody who is receiving formal training in philosophy, why you abandoned that discipline and decided to write a novel instead.
Thank you. Thanks for those nice words, and thank you, Duncan, for that introduction. And thank you all for having me here and for being here. I think the philosophy was my first reading love. It was through philosophy that I entered literature. By the time I was doing my PhD, by the time I was applying for my PhD, I had already, psychologically abandoned philosophy. I applied to my I did my PhD to have time to write fiction. In a sense, I don't know. I don't know if I really did a PhD in a substantial. I do have the PhD, and
the back of the second says eventually receiving a doctorate.
I did eventually receive it. I studied. As a boy in school, we had a really good bookshop in Sri Lanka that had a lot of philosophy. I read. I watched the Oliver Stone movie, Alexander. There was Anthony Hopkins did a little cameo as Aristotle, and I was touched by. I clearly couldn't be Alexander, so I thought I'd try to be Aristotle as a young kid. And I went to the bookshop and I bought a lot of those books, and I read them, and it was really it was my first love. And I studied at a university in the Anglophone world. There are different traditions of philosophy, obviously, and the one that is most prominent in the Anglophone world is what they call analytic philosophy, which at least traditionally emphasizes what's called conceptual analysis, thinking about how we use words, how philosophical problems might be a result of the misleading grammar of ordinary language, how philosophical problems might be dissolved or resolved by paying careful attention to the nuances of philosophical usage. There's a lot of, this kind of tradition sees itself as continuous with the sciences. There's this kind of emphasis on rigor, on precision, and it was very useful for me as an education. But it slowly became clear to me that analytic philosophy, or what is often called analytic philosophy, is in search of statements that can be labeled either true or false. Declarative statements. These are, philosophical truth comes in the form of a declarative statement that can be true or false, and which can be separable from the justification that's given for it. And I think as I spend more time doing philosophy, it struck me that the kind of truth that I'm looking for when I'm searching, when I go to philosophy, it's less in the form of a statement that can be affirmed or negated than in the form of a mood. When I was drawn to philosophy first, there was a certain kind of, in the philosophical text, wonder, a certain kind of mystery, philosophical questions, when they arise originally, are often, they're described they come up in a specific context. There's a certain charge to them that comes from, how do you know other minds? What is knowledge? What exists beyond is there anything beyond appearance? These are all questions that in academic philosophy people tend to ask removed or from the environments in which they...
And you felt unsatisfied by the way analytic philosophy was practiced in the Anglophone academy today.
Yeah, it's the mood of philosophy that I was interested in, not the declarative sentences that might result from it. And so I thought if you can find a way of thinking philosophically inside a literary text, inside a real concrete specified context, then there's a way for philosophical questions to get the charge, to be charged in a way that they might not otherwise be.
But so can I ask the positive question then, which is why specifically the form of the novel? Like, why follow, both, not to jump ahead to a passage notes, but really both of the novels follow really one person, like one character, one person. It's a study in a way of an individual life, an individual mind. Like, why do you feel that the novel was the form to do the kind of thinking that you wanted to do?
I think it had to do with, Robert Musil, the turn of the previous century Austrian writer. He has a book called Man Without Qualities that I read, and it's a very essayistic philosophical text. But all of the essay, all of the thought, all of the meditation it's in the context of a kind of narrative. I guess one reads a book like that, and I was just I was very young and I was very moved by it. I wanted to be the kind of person who could think in this way, who could think with clarity, but also inside context.
Could I ask the question about why I can see how Musil is an influence for the second novel, but could I ask so the first novel follows, it's a single day really, like a sort of 24-hour period following the life of a Tamil man in a camp, sort of doing two things, I would say, at once. One, sort of evading aerial warfare, sort of the state-sponsored violence of the Sri Lankan government, and two, also kind of interestingly, and I wonder if you would talk about the politics of this, kind of staying far away to make sure that he's not recruited by the Tigers. And so that novel, I feel, unlike A Passage North, which makes these philosophical digressions, stays really close to sort of bodily experience and thought, and just one person. It's not kind of going off in the sort of tradition of the philosophical novel and its flights of. So why the form of the first novel? This very close attention to one person and these bodily, there's this beautiful scene of showering and these really sort of ordinary things in this kind of extraordinary circumstance.
I must have been 23 when I started that book. It would have been 2011, and 2 years after. I'd wanted to be a writer. I was a bookish, an unsociable child, and I was interested in philosophy. And then we had I grew up in Sri Lanka in the midst of the war. And then there was a genocide in my country that I was alive for but removed from. And I think, as is often the case when you belong to such a community, genocide is a very, it's internally polarizing in the sense that there are some members of a society that experience such things directly, and there are some people who are forced to witness. I was in, fortunately, the latter category, it kind of, there's still, I don't think, any event any historical event that has shaped my consciousness so much as that. It was not my interest to write political texts or to write, in fact, about war. But it simply happened, and when it happened, I was at the beginning of my attempt at literature. So it wasn't a choice,
Do you think of it at all as a duty or an obligation, or do you think that you don't have agency in that kind of way? Like, I mean, the way you framed it is like, oh, this is just I had to write about this.
Yeah, I don't think of it as a duty because, well, the people, there are different accounts of the numbers, but the 170,000 who were killed were already dead by the time I began writing. And so writing, especially writing in a foreign language like English, it makes no difference. I mean, the dead are dead, and the bereaved will spend their lives in bereavement. The issue is over. I don't belong to the group of people who believe that, the English language novel has political significance. So it's something that I personally had no other choice but to dwell on these subjects.
Can I ask, do you think that there's any utility of the novel beyond writing for yourself? Like, it sounds like you wrote for yourself in a way. But do you think that the novel, do you think of the novel as bearing witness? Do you or do you? I do. I want to ask you about the English language. You said English language, you've said a few things about English language works. One of them is that English is a language without intimacy. Another one is that Anglophone writing is doomed to parochialism. And then my favorite one is, I hate the English-speaking communities of Sri Lanka, India, South Asia. I want, those I feel put together, it's maybe a little unfair. You didn't say them all at once, but I wonder if... So you spoke about Mosul. I guess, do you think that the language of writing bears any impact? You said you don't think that the English novel does anything. Do you think that literature in other languages can do anything? Is this a stance about the novel as a genre? What's the place of Tamil in your... I'm
in the funny position of writing in the English language, but coming from a much longer and richer literary tradition. For reasons that I guess people are more or less aware of, urbanization, globalization, the desire for class mobility, I was educated in English. Also growing up, we were told to not speak in Tamil in public spaces and all of these things. So, there were various external and internal restrictions on my relation to Tamil. It was a family language, but not a language of education. I said a lot of those things. I said them. Those were all with my first book, and I published it when I was kind of young, and I was still, I still had a lot of, petty resentments and chips on my shoulder, and I've stopped saying things like this. But I do think I do stand behind them. I can no longer remember what the specific quotes were, but I can certainly tell you. I can
read them out loud again.
No, I can certainly say that I do think it would be different the statement about intimacy. English is a language without where one cannot picture the reader. English is so widely accessible. The fact that someone speaks English has no bearing on their political views, their social formation, their personality, or their sensibility. It's not the case with a language like Tamil, which has not been globally institutionalized, at least not in our era. And And so when you write in Tamil, you know that you have a certain kind of reader, a reader with a certain kind of social formation, a reader with a certain kind of history, a reader with probably certain physical locations. And so one knows one's reader more. As a result of that knowledge, a certain kind of intimacy is possible in the writing that is not possible in a language like English. So for example, that's why I will never write nonfiction in English, because it feels to me far too what's the word? To put me in too vulnerable a position. If I'm writing in Tamil, it's easier for me to, I guess, to set my position up vis-a-vis an imagined reader much more easily. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I want to in some ways go back a little bit and talk about guilt.
Guilt, yeah.
Because another thing that you said about the first book is that you wrote it to punish yourself.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to me that guilt is quite present in the second novel. I think the main character in the second novel is guilty, like feels guilty. And guilt is only present in the first novel when you think about like you writing it. Like guilt itself as an emotion actually is completely absent from the first novel. And so I was wondering how you think about the relationship that you have to guilt and writing, and why choose to put it in the second novel.
Yeah, I mean, I've always known myself to be a guilty person. And then, obviously, when the genocide took place, it was very obvious where that guilt should attach itself. I was immersed in it. I didn't see the guilt. It was simply my condition for many years. I think after a while, I was able to see that particular text as an expression of guilt. And so in my second novel, which is, my first novel is a kind of imagined projection of myself or somebody like myself or whatever into the middle of a genocide. It's very far removed from anything I've seen or heard or experienced. Incidentally, that's kind of, I mean, it's related to your first question about, the point you mentioned about the body in that book. Me and the protagonist, the only thing we had in common were the fact that we have a body, mm-hmm. and the fact that we both need to eat and to sleep and to shit and to walk. And so these were the experiences. Mm-hmm. My goal in that novel was to carve out a space where an individual might have the freedom to engage in these daily acts of care, these acts of, these acts that constitute the self. To give this character this freedom that he probably didn't have in real life. It was an act of imagination. My second novel was much more about the condition of somebody who is forced to witness the genocide from outside, which is to say, the condition of someone like myself. And yeah, I mean, the word guilt comes up in that text a lot. I don't think I had, I read a couple of years ago, I was reading a lot of Melanie Klein, the psychoanalyst. She has a beautiful paper, I forget what it's called, but Guilt and Reparation or something like this. She describes guilt as part of what she calls the depressive position. It belongs to a certain stage. I read this casually, I might be paraphrasing it wrong, but it belongs to a certain stage in a child's development in which they realize that a lot of the aggression against their mother or their parental figure has been misdirected. They've been expressing resentment, expressing aggression, and then at some point they realize that it's the mother they love, not just some kind of evil mother that they've been trying to hurt, and it results in guilt. She describes, I think, at some point, a child who is stuck in this position, who's unable to move on from this particular stage. As she has this example of kids who, if you present them with two pieces of string, they immediately tie up the two pieces of string. To such a child, the two pieces of string are always already cut and separated. The child's desire is the child sees the two strings as in need of repair, as opposed to just two separate strings. She connects guilt with the desire to repair or the desire to fix what one has broken. And I think I realized when I read that a lot of my work is engaged with reparation, with fictive reparation. I mean, reparation, repairing that unfortunately cannot take place in the real world. A lot of my fiction is about creating space, imaginary space for that kind of reparation. I think that's how guilt. I mean, I think that's the role that it plays in my writing.
I want to ask a couple of formal questions about the novels. Now, I guess I'll move on to A Passage North. This will reveal sort of my bias as a critic, but I write about speech in the novel, and you don't have any speech in your novel. And I wanted to ask about, and by what I mean by that is there's no direct speech in the novel. We don't get characters quoted as saying something like really specific and explicit. I wanted to ask you about how much that was a conscious choice, and also whether you thought about what the narrative effects of that decision were. Like what do you think is both gained and lost maybe by not including characters speaking in a novel?
I think formally, technically, because in A Passage North, a lot of the dialogues are taking place between Tamil language speakers. I was put in the position, if I was to have direct quotation of the speech of these characters, these characters might be speaking in different dialects, might be speaking in different social classes. There are ways of mapping out or marking out conventionalized ways in English, difference in social position that, you might take different forms of speech from, from the United Kingdom, and the different ways class shapes speech here, or in the United States, for example. But to impose those particular differences in dialect or idiolect into this context would be kind of absurd. Like you wouldn't want to read, a victim of genocide in my book from Sri Lanka speaking, working class English, like from the UK or from, I don't know. So it felt to me like it felt more accurate, not accurate, but it felt more honest to simply record this, to say that this is what the character has said, or this is what the speech of the character amounts to, rather than, I don't know if that is actually the direct indirect speech distinction.
That's so. I mean, I guess I have two follow-up questions to that. One is, why did you think about just not translating it and just putting the Tamil in speech, or like is there a reason that, like, obviously that's a sort of deliberately opaque move to some readers, and like that could be a choice. But then the second question is, so the second novel follows a protagonist as he makes a journey through Sri Lanka from south to north to go to a funeral for a woman who has died, possibly by suicide. It's left ambiguous. A woman who was a caretaker for this protagonist's grandmother. There's an exception to the direct speech in the novel, which is that Rani's daughter, you record her speech basically exactly. Why did you make that decision?
Well, I guess I was hoping that there was no critic who would like point it out when I don't know. I mean, I can't tell you. But I can say, in general, I have with speech, I know there are writers who focus. I mean, who will say, I just have difficulty being interested in a lot of what people have to say, and I think I know that there are writers who report speech or whatever. They present a person's speech and they manage to find ways to bring out what is not said, or the tone in which something is said, the pauses, the hesitations, the silences, to bring out all of what is occluded or concealed in speech. But that's always seemed to me a lot of work, and I think because I came to writing from philosophy. This is my excuse for a lot of things, actually. I've always found it easier simply to point, to say the things, to paraphrase what I find interesting or what needs to be said in the speech, maybe for the narrative or maybe for what comes next, but not actually,
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It makes sense, but I don't know if I fully feel satisfied.
I don't stand by this answer anymore.
Okay.
This is what I used to say when I was asked for this, when I was asked about this book.
Yeah.
I mean, I think now.
Sorry, I'll just say a reason for my dissatisfaction.
Sorry, please.
So one reason is that what you're saying is like it takes a lot of work, and I don't really want to do that work. And so that answer suggests like I'm lazy, but that's not true. Like that's totally not true about reading your work, right? In fact, like another formal question is that you write extraordinarily long sentences, really long. Syntactically perfect sentences. That takes a lot of effort. Like you seem like somebody who puts a lot of effort into writing your sentences.
Yes. I work hard, I do work hard. And when I say I don't have the, what do I mean? I sometimes distinguish between patient and impatient writers.
Mm-hmm.
I take myself to be an impatient writer. What I mean by that is that a lot of the traditional apparati of the novel, it seems like a lot of work for me,
mm-hmm.
and not necessary to get to where I want to get in writing. I need narrative, I need description.
Mm-hmm.
I need to be able to specify context and situation in like a nuanced way, in a fine-grained way. But
you don't need plot.
But I don't need plot, or I haven't needed plot, and I haven't needed dialogue to do those things. I've been impatient with those. I want to. I mean, who are the writers I think of as impatient? It's difficult. They're not coming to mind. I mean, the one that comes to mind is Clarice Lispector. There's just a certain kind of, everything else is frivolous. Let us now deal with what we want to deal with, and let us put everything else aside. I've tried to cultivate patience.
Mm-hmm.
I'm doing that with my present novel,
mm-hmm.
which I am trying to plot.
Mm-hmm.
Like personally, I think I tend to be impatient about a lot of things around the novel.
Yeah, okay.
Does that make
that? I mean, I will say you don't come across as an impatient writer, again, for the reasons I've said. So, yet another formal question. So, again, forgive my just playing to cliche as English professor, but there's a narrative theorist, Gerard Jeanette, who has a formulation about narrative time and story time, right? And so, for instance, dialogue is a time where NT equals ST, right? Like it's an exact correlation. Like you say the words, that's how long it takes. You don't have any of that, right? Like there's no scene. There's no, and in fact, what your novels, especially A Passage North, has is that narrative time far exceeds story time.
Yeah.
Right. So I guess, how are you thinking about time when you're writing?
I love Jeanette.
Yeah.
I love his book on Proust. I've just read the first one, but. How to put it? Real life does not. There are certain things that happen in life that we do not have enough time to reflect on. often, there's an onslaught of event and experience, and before one can think about or dwell in or process the first, the second is already on its way. It's similar to, I don't know if you keep a journal, but sometimes you're writing in your journal and you want to take note of what has happened, but you leave it for one day because something else has happened. In the intervening period, more stuff happens, and at a certain point, it begins to seem pointless to even record all of this. I
don't keep a journal for this reason. Yeah.
Right. I haven't written in the last few weeks because for precisely this reason. And then life also seems filled with non-events. Months can pass in which you can ask, where did my time go? What did I do with it? And why don't I have anything to show for it? Except this additional crease under my eye. And so it's always seemed, life doesn't give itself enough time, and it always has seemed to me that that fiction has the power to give events the duration they deserve. So that an event that takes place over a certain, short period of clock time can actually it has a much greater duration in the mind, and fiction can represent that. And so it's about, there's a formulation that the Spanish writer Javier Marias uses that I think he had this in mind, but he says fiction can give time the time is due. Mm-hmm. And I think that's how I think about it, or that's how I have thought about it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I was going to make a joke, but I won't make a joke. Do you think that Proust has a big influence on your writing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Me too. I also think that.
Yeah.
On yours, not on mine. Certainly not on mine. Yeah. Do you think that that there is what would you say to somebody who said that your subject is so different to Proust that that comparison, how do you think about what Proust's influence is? Is it on the ordinary? Is it about time? Is it about sentences? What do you think you take from Proust?
Oh, that's a hard question. Okay. Proust deals with a kind of high bourgeois, aristocratic, European, French milieu that has nothing to do with me or my sense with where I've grown up or with what I know. I think it's a mark of his his capabilities as a writer that he's able to make that material so rich and so philosophical and so and so profound. I certainly am moved and influenced by his psychological insight, his relation to time, his he's so good, and I
and doesn't write in English, so
he also doesn't write. He writes in another language.
Could I ask you to read from your?
Yeah, I still haven't. I'm still thinking about this question.
Yeah, and, we'll come back. We'll come back to it after. But I think maybe people can hear their own Proustian influence in yours.
So this is from an excerpt that I published in the Paris Review of from my new novel, which is not complete. Just to give a little bit of context, the main character Navini is from Toronto. Her mother, who's kind of depressed, has been invited to New York, where she lives, to spend a week with her. And as happens, I think generally during such visits, there's been a big fight after the two of them have gone shopping together. Navini has thrown stuff around the around the apartment, like caused a big scene, like insulted and humiliated her mother, who is very thin-skinned, shut the door and left. An hour later, she comes back. Her mother is asleep. The lights are off. She gets into bed. They're both awake, but they're both pretending to be asleep. The truth Navini knew, though she did not like to acknowledge it, was that her actions that night hadn't been exceptional. It was easy and perhaps convenient to forget, since in other respects their relationship was as good as it ever had been. But the truth was that they'd been having more and more of these sudden explosive fights in the past couple of years, fights that recurred almost every time she stayed in Toronto for more than a few days, fights that often began as small quarrels or arguments, sometimes initiated by her, sometimes by her mother, though no matter how vigilant she was, no matter how many times she told herself she wouldn't let it happen again, for some reason it was always she who insisted on escalating what might have been a small dispute into a full-scale existential confrontation. It had happened when she'd gone home for the holidays in December, it had happened when she'd visited for a few days the previous August, and it happened a few times that previous year too. And while these fights hadn't been entirely her fault, her mother could still be as hurtful as she'd ever been, still insisted on giving back as good as she got, even if in general she'd become less likely to instigate or escalate. What felt new was her own inability to disengage or walk away, as though there was some part of her that needed to push through to the very limits of her anger whenever she fought with her mother, to wring from it every last sweet drop. The fights, Navini had noticed, had all seemed to follow more or less the same pattern. Something would be said or done, usually unconsciously, that caused the other's ears to prick up, that led them to furrow their brows and respond with a tone of severity or irritation that was maybe not quite deserved. This, in turn, would elicit a sharp response from the first person, most likely in the form of something that could itself be interpreted as an attack. And from there, the situation would quickly escalate, both of them bringing up recent affronts or humiliations, branching out to injuries from further back in time, wounds of increasingly ancient provenance coming to light as they both cast desperately back in furious search of the one historical grievance that would finally shut down the other's attempts to play victim. The orbit of accusation would expand so quickly and so far beyond the initial locus of conflict that both of them would soon forget how the argument had started, as though both the original front and the offense that was taken in turn were just a pretext for this ever-widening call and response of grievance. Navini's recriminations usually revolving around the fact that her mother refused to show need or vulnerability, her mother's around the fact that she wasn't wanted or needed by her children. It was a process once begun that could seldom be stopped, the trajectory and endpoint fixed from the very start, each of them raising the stakes with their insults, accusations, and ultimatums, challenging the other to go one step further, moving in tandem closer and closer to the edge. Both of them knew, theoretically, that there existed in these conflicts a line beyond which reconciliation would no longer be possible, and both of them, even if neither wanted to be the first to cross this line, wanted the other to know that they were willing to do so. That for the sake of justice, they were willing even to put their relationship at risk. Because this was the question, after all, that they were both trying to decide in these moments of escalation. This was the question really being asked in these moments of rage. The basic, most fundamental question of their relationship, of all human relationships maybe. Which of them needed the other more? Who was more capable of going it alone? The question was never resolved within any particular fight. For the only way to end the escalation was to speak so violently or with such moral conviction that the other person was stopped in their tracks. The only way to win was to make it deafeningly clear through your superior rage that your wound was the deeper one and that you would brook no compromise. In order for this to happen, the force of your statement had to so decisively outstrip the tit-for-tat escalation preceding it that the other person grasped at once the futility of trying to surpass it, was compelled in response to back down or walk away. But the fact was that even the loudest, most vicious, most unexpected words could be answered back if your opponent was stubborn and resourceful enough. It was always possible, after all, for the other person to perform some minor gesture of insubordination, to scoff, roll their eyes, or mutter back some accusation, enough to make it clear, even if their anger could no longer match yours, that they still did not take your grievance to be more legitimate than theirs. This had been one of her mother's strategies in their recent fights, to deny Navini the justice of having the last word that her anger had earned. And it was for this reason, probably, that their fights had also moved so often from the sphere of the verbal to the physical. For her mother's refusal in these moments to admit that she was wrong, Her refusal to abide by the rules of the contest just staged only ever had the effect of setting Navani off further, of making her look for a way to prove immediately and irrefutably that what she was saying was real, not just rhetoric or one-upmanship. Sometimes only a physical, tangible act of violence seemed capable of achieving this purpose, slamming a door, shattering a plate, pounding your head against a wall, or slapping your own face. Though becoming violent was, of course, always a self-defeating maneuver, because just as there was a contest, whenever the fight was escalating, to see who was willing to venture closest to the line of no return, so there was a contest, once the fight was over, to see who could bear the gulf that separated them longer, to see who would break down and seek rapprochement first, a contest she would always be forced to concede if she resorted to violence earlier on.
So this is quite different, I think, to the first two novels. I think a really obvious thing that some people might say that makes it different is that the protagonist is a woman. I'm not going to say the obvious thing. What strikes me as the most significant difference is that both the first novel and the second novel were ultimately interested in one person alone. And this novel feels, so I've read, 30 pages or 35 pages or something, so I can't speak to the whole, but it feels fundamentally about relationships, that it's about how a person is in relation to another person. And the section that I read was just about a mother and a daughter. That strikes me as an entirely different project to the first two. Does it feel that way?
Yeah, I don't know if it feels like a different project entirely, but it is different. When I was writing my first two novels, I had this idea that the truth of a person, what a person represented, the stance towards life that they offered you as an observer to take up for yourself, was always to be found in that person, in that person's solitude. What I mean to say is, if you want to know the truth of a person, find them when they're alone, when they believe they're being unobserved. Watch their posture, watch their gait, watch the expression on their face, watch the mood with which they move around, and that is the truth of the person. So I would always have characters alone in these first two books, and even if they're thinking about, their dealings with other people, they would be thinking about these dealings alone. I have to say, a lot of the change in my writing, or in this particular aspect, has to do with Elena Ferrante. I just, her books struck me as very much applicable to my own, in the life of my own immediate and extended family and community. Specifically, her focus on violence. Violence is always between two people, in interpersonal relationships. And yeah, I was just really struck by the sense in which for her, these people are always already with others. I guess when I was younger, I used to think of solitude. Solitude was a home state, and being with others was an excursion one makes from this home state and then re-enters. But any interaction with the others was always an exception to this state of being with oneself. And I think as I've grown older and as, more and more social obligations present themselves to me, I have started to think of solitude actually as a temporary provisional solace from being with others and being in the world. And that's the way in which Navani is alone in this book. It's not her home state. It's an escape for her.
Can I contradict myself? I wasn't going to. It's not deliberate. I haven't set a trap. Actually, I don't know if I think the first two books are about people being alone. Which is that when I think about it, I think one thing that maybe, I don't know if many people would say about your books, but I think are true about your books, is that, these are books about war and violence and all of these things, but really they're like kind of about desire. And I mean desire quite specifically, not only, but there are some of the most exquisite passages in both the first and the second book are about the male main character wanting something from another person and being in a state of existing with the other person. And actually, that is what is set in contrast to the times in which the male characters are alone. Like, we do see them actually with other people, and we see them in this state of a desire for a relationship, and their behavior changes in the presence of another person. But I would still like to stand by, this feels different, which is that this book feels like one in which like the emotions that are navigated between two people are extraordinarily negative sometimes, that they're mixed, that it's not just about desire, that it's also about anger or resentment or hurt or upset. Does that feel like a reflection?
It makes sense. I don't know if, that these books are different in ways, and they're similar in ways. The first books are, there is an undercurrent. Sometimes it becomes very explicit of longing, of yearning. I think of yearning. What I think of as yearning is, desire that doesn't have an object, desire, or a state in which a character or a person knows that something is missing and seeks for something outside of themselves, but perhaps doesn't know what to get, doesn't know what it is specifically that they're searching for. They cannot direct themselves in any particular way, and they wander because they don't know what they're searching for. I think that longing was strongly present in both these texts. I can't, one tends to, I'm middle-aged now, I guess.
That would make me middle-aged, so I'm not going to accept that as a statement. Yeah.
We're reaching the end of our youth, maybe.
Okay.
Is that? And it seems that as life, it seems that we become. My experience with aging so far is that it seems that as we become older, we become more fixed in ourselves, our habits. One always dreams of dramatic change, right? Of waking up and being different, of being, and those fantasies seem to become more and more implausible the older one gets, as one's relationships and life situation becomes more fixed, as the future seems like it's going to be more and more similar to the present than in that preceding time. Mm-hmm. And I guess as a result of that, desire or longing, the pursuit of that which you don't have and that which you believe will somehow complete you, has just it's become less significant in my writing. I think. It's not a very nice answer, but I feel I move towards now characters that, they're simply stuck with having to live out their lives. Yeah.
That is a depressing answer. I have one small question, or one specific question, and then maybe one bigger question. Why don't you write in the first person? Like, why do you choose the close third person?
I have a very strong aversion to writing in the first person, actually.
Tell me why.
I don't know. I really don't know. There's a lot of great novelists that I love who write in the first person. It's not about what I can appreciate. I think.
Can I suggest one reason why I think you don't write in the first person? So something that you do very often is you use the first person plural. You say we, and you say one. Like you use, and you do that to make sentences that have a universalizing effect. Like there was a moment in that, but now I forget the sentence, which is like one always, we always, and you often say always, and you can't,
Right.
and you can't do that in the first. But you can't say we always, because you're making a kind of philosophical, general statement about the human condition. Does that sound like a
it's funny. Whenever I do say always, it's almost certainly because I feel some doubt that it's always happening. Kind of like how academics use the word precisely. I think that has to do with it. I mean, I think personally, in terms of my individual sensibility, I'm a person that finds it hard to give my own feelings significance unless I can find some way to say other people feel this way too, or there is some objective reason that I should feel this way, and so somehow universalizing, using the first person plural, using one, it allows me to speak what's inside of me, while at the same time it also reassures me that I'm not being let's say not being self-indulgent. Yeah, that would be something that I would feel a little bit self-indulgent if I used the first person. But again, I mean, I really a lot of the books I love most are in the first person. It's just some weird thing I have.
Can I ask you another question?
Please.
So I'm pretty averse to kind of questions about identity of the writer, but I can't help myself. Your first book says Anuk Arudpragasam is from Colombo, Sri Lanka. And is currently completing a dissertation. Your second book says Anuk Arudpragasam was born and raised in Colombo, Sri Lanka. I think many people might not see the difference between those two sentences. For me, they seem like really starkly different sentences. Are they?
What seems different to you about them?
One of them is saying that you belong to a place, and the other one is saying that like that just happened to be the place that you spent time in. One of them is claiming a sense of belonging, like I'm Sri Lankan. The other one is I was born there. I think that accurately characterizes a change in the 5 or 6 years that separates these novels. Yeah. How would you write that sentence now?
I don't know. I would have to think about it, but I would probably say I'm a Tamil writer. I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, I come from a community that maybe 3.5 million of us, and maybe close to 1.5 million live outside the island of Sri Lanka. Most of my relatives are like some mixture of immigrants and refugees in Toronto, in London, in Paris, in Berlin, in Australia, in South India. I was like really the only family, and in Jaffna in northern Sri Lanka. And then I left Sri Lanka when I was 18, and I haven't, I visit because my family lives there, but I haven't gone back very often. And so, over the years, I've come to see myself as belonging to the Tamil diaspora rather than I use a Sri Lankan passport, but. But it's a ambivalent issue.
Okay, last question from me, and then we'll turn it over. So the passage that you read out, I think, in some ways that could be a mother and a daughter. I mean, they could be like white, and in California, the little part that you read out, right? There's no there's nothing in that section as far as I remember, But in the longer section that I read, there's actually quite a lot. And for me, I mean, I'll say like a mother's cruelty to a daughter like just feels very like painful, I think. But at one point, this mother says, I should have joined the Tigers. Like, why did I waste my life raising you and your brother? Like, that's like, ouch. That's like a particular kind of remark, I think. And I guess maybe the question to end is that you don't handhold your readers at all about contextual political, like this book has there's very little to, you don't give your readers like a history of the war, a history of the violence, a history of the liberation movement, like, you know, there's so why don't you do that? And I won't accept because I'm lazy as an answer.
I mean, I qualified that statement. But, well, the comment the mother makes about I should have been a fighter rather than your mother is unfortunately a comment that most children from my society have heard from their mothers at some point. You know, it's also just part of.
It's a cliche.
I mean, it's a trope. Yeah, it's part of how kids are raised.
But it doesn't make it hurt any less.
Huh?
It doesn't make it hurt any less. Like, it's still. I mean, somebody can say, you know, like there are many things that are tropes that's still very painful.
I mean, I think a big part of trauma is normalization. I think it's not as. I don't think it's as painful when everybody experiences it actually. But I mean, that's another question that I'm not really qualified to talk about. In terms of like political context, with that first book, you're right that there's no context. I'll try to say very quickly why that was the case. But that book was, as I said, set in genocide, and as you said. It was an act of self-punishment in a way to write that, and you know, at the time I was not a published writer, so the goal was not just to punish myself as a writer. My goal was to punish myself as a reader. Mm-hmm. The reader invariably is punished by that book, and you know, because of the violence of that material, and it's about. I mean, what does political context do, or what does it mean to politically contextualize something? Suppose a child. This happened to me once in school. I saw my mom. She came to pick me up. I was maybe 9 or 10. I was really excited to see her. I ran in her direction and I fell right in front of her. I bloodied my knee. I got up and started crying, and she kind of gave me a little slap. She couldn't deal with my pain, right? She couldn't deal with the fact that I was in pain. Mm-hmm. When somebody is in pain, the instinctive desire is to be able to do something. If I fall, you know, my mother, what did she do? She dusted my knee off. She stopped me crying. She cleaned the wound. She put a Band-Aid, whatever. Now, think of now somebody else's pain in a context in which you are unable to act. Think of somebody in hospital with some kind of like long-term illness. These are situations where you're forced to dwell on the person's pain and the person's condition in a much more intense way than the parallel case where you can do something. What I'm trying to say is that faced with somebody's pain, the ability to do something to rectify or repair or resolve that pain is actually very relieving for the spectator, for mm-hmm. the observer. Mm-hmm. It's a way of, we can put it in the following way, it's a way of not having to pay attention to that pain. So in this novel, I'm presenting the reader with all these kinds of violence. And so what does political context do? Political context allows the reader to, there are certain questions that one asks when confronted with such kind of pain. Who is responsible? Why did it happen? When did it happen? What can we do about it? Can we hold the perpetrators responsible? Can the victims can their lives be changed? Can their grievances be addressed? And to allow the reader to ask such questions is allowing the reader to escape the anxiety of dealing with the character's pain. Mm-hmm. So when I remove the context in this way, the reader is unable to ask these questions, and is forced to dwell on, Dinesh and Ganga in the middle of this genocide, which is many of us found out the extent of the death and the killing only after the genocide, only after it was all over. Our experience was very much one of, like agencylessness. And so I wanted...
You wanted to strip away all relief for the reader.
I wanted there to be no agency. I wanted them to have no agency, yeah.
And you should all read this book. Well, let's open up to some questions from all of you.
Hi, thanks for being here. Really big fan of your work. So I'm a philosophy PhD student as well, and I also kind of like to write fiction. I was writing fiction when I was younger, and as I've gone on in studying philosophy, one thing which I have found, in my attempts to write, and I'm wondering what your experience was with this, is how to turn a piece of fiction into a philosophical experience without it merely being a bunch of philosophical theses, with a plot lightly draped over it. And I think this is something that you managed to do very well in your work, where your work, pays attention to certain questions and shows the, virtues of a certain sort of training and a certain sort of way of thinking, but still retains certain literary virtues. So I'm wondering how you navigate this.
Thank you. I mean, yeah, it's definitely, it's something I've thought about a lot. I mean, one can think of certain philosophical texts as also, there's the movement between the specific and the universal, right? In philosophy, the universal is argued for. There's a back and forth of reasons for a claim. In literature, it's also in a way argued for, not in the same way, but something is presented, and it's presented with a certain kind of conviction and with a certain kind of convincingness that, I guess, let's say, strikes the reader intuitively, independent of arguments, maybe. But this movement between the specific and the universal, one can think of, the way I talked about it earlier, you have the philosophical question as it's asked in academic philosophy, removed from context, removed from the mood in which the philosophical question might strike us in the real lived philosophical moment. And I said, if you start with the specific and the situation, you can find a way to move out in the text, right? But literature allows you to start from the specific, and in doing so, it charges the philosophical question when it arises, in a way that the philosophical question is not charged in the academic text. You could also start the other way, I guess, and there are certain writers, like Hannah Arendt, like Eichmann in Jerusalem, like I'm trying to think now, none of them are coming to mind immediately, but there's a number of philosophical texts that also start specifically. They start with a certain kind of, setting up a certain kind of context, and the question arises in that context. And then there is actually a giving and taking of reasons for the stance that the writer has, but that is always related back to the context that is, it's a kind of mode of like philosophical argumentation that is kind of related to like richly specified context, but nevertheless contains argument. I don't know if what I'm saying makes sense in this, because I haven't really worked these things out myself. I've definitely tried that kind of philosophical writing. It's never seemed it never seems to have worked out for me in the way, and it's really, I don't know, it is very difficult. There are writers who write philosophically, and so I've just, like Proust, Musil, like a bunch of people who I've just studied. I've just studied and I've just emulated them. But I think it's a question I'm always going to be like struggling with, I think.
I just wanted to ask you a question. She asked a question about writing in a fast voice. You grew up in an extended family situation. So you, with extended family, not nuclear family, do you think you still find that you need permission to be able to disclose certain things or talk about that without, so you say you don't want to be egotistical and be talking yourself. Do you think that limits how you feel you can say everything without fearing that somebody say, "Whoa, why did you say that? Why did you say that?" Do you think that, because I think that people who grow up in a nuclear family, if you come from post-colonial South, they have a certain ego, a certain license to be able to think of the self and talk of the self with authority. Whereas if you come in certain nuclear family situations or setting, you feel there are certain things you can't say or do without license, without being asked, why did you say that? Or just...
Well, actually, 90% of my family was forced to leave the country. So actually, I did grow up in a kind of intensely nuclear and isolated family. I don't know if that's connected, but that was the case. And I think, again, who really knows why we have these aversions or these particular why we're drawn towards certain things. I could give you an explanation, a biographical explanation, but all I have to show for it is the fact that I can write in this way and not in other ways. I can't really explain it. But
she asked you a lot of identity, question of place or context and that, but you seem to be, on the other hand, you just see progression of being younger and being more control, you get older and more experience, or just accountable for community or self. It's tension between what you report or what you were able to say in comfort, intimacy.
Yeah. I mean, it's something for me to for me to think about. I mean, we often talk about our writing. There's no other choice but to talk about it in simplifying platitudes, right? Any explanation or interpretation could have another. But thank you for the question. Yeah.
Hi, I cannot believe I'm here. I'm such a big fan, and it's been such an honor listening to you speak about your books. My question is about The Story of a Brief Marriage. That is my favorite book. I'm writing about it in my dissertation. But when you were talking, I remembered this scene from The Story of a Brief Marriage where Dinesh is shoveling the dirt, and it is at this moment that he gets the marriage proposal. And while you were speaking about all the other things surrounding your books, I was thinking about how you, as an author, there is this wound, and you, as an author, you're shoveling dirt into the wound as a method. So you make dirt a method in your writing. And what I'm thinking about is pity, right? The fact that when there is a novel, particularly from the Global South, although I have some problems with the term Global South, but I'll just use that term for now. When there is a novel about war or about trauma from the Global South, and it's presented to the Western neoliberal audience, there is this kind of mode of bearing witness, which is oftentimes like, oh, I'm so sorry this happened, and now I'm going to bear witness. And it's also like a sort of mode of feeling better about the person who's for the person who's reading to feel better because now they've felt sorry about the person. So to me, it seems like you're offering dirt and the various moments in which Dinesh is really intimate with his bodily dirt and the dirt that's from the rubble of the war as modes to defy that kind of neoliberal pity. And I was... wondering what you'd say about that.
Thank you. I think, what you say in some way, resonates. I can't speak for a reader and what goes on in their mind and for the particular kinds of pleasure or benefit they get from reading my work or anybody's work. I do. I can say, though, that I have some issue with this notion of bearing witness. For example, with the genocide in Sri Lanka, there were plenty of people who bore witness. the people who were there, their relatives abroad. The Tamil community bore witness. 70 million people in South India, Tamil Nadu, bore witness. I don't see particularly why anybody else needs to bear witness or what the function of their bearing witness is, especially when they can do nothing to help, and especially when they did nothing to help as it was happening. But I will also say that, there is something, or especially about that text, very intimate. And there is, when I wrote that book, I was not aware of myself as a writer, really. I mean, I was unpublished. I mean, after my second novel, I was nominated for this big British prize, and my editor told me, well, now you have a readership. And it really kind of was an important moment for me because I'd never thought of this idea of a readership before. I was like, okay, now you have readers. And I think it bothered me, as in, one.
It's all for readers.
I mean, no, they're very nice. They're very nice. It's just, they change one's relation to, the intimacy or secrecy with which one can write. Yeah. I write, or I used to write in the way that I wrote in my journal. I can no longer quite do that. That's an effect of, publishing in the way that in the way that I do.
Can I ask a follow-up question to this question? So, I read both books when they came out, and I told you this already, but I reread them both this weekend, like over the last 3 days, in a context which felt pretty different to me after Gaza and with Iran right now, and I was thinking, like, it felt close, the first book, close to unbearable.
This time?
Yeah, this time. Like, it felt close to unbearable. And I wanted to ask about this question of, like, unbearable and also, like, this I wrote it to punish myself. I also really kind of wanted to punish the reader. I wanted to take away context because context is relief. Like, I wanted the reader to be in this position of, like, discomfort, pain. But the paradox of this is that, in fact, and to bring in the, like, a pesky reader, is that one actually can't write an unbearable novel because then no one would read it. Like, you need to skirt the line of writing a novel that actually people will read. Do you think about that?
No. Sorry, I wasn't. No, I see your question, and
okay, let me ask it a different way. It's also a really, really beautiful novel. In that, on one kind of, like, purely aesthetic level, like, the sentences are very beautiful, but also it's a novel which is about something kind of like, it's like, to use like a cliche, but I think that is true, like the transcendence of the human spirit. Like, there's something, like, deeply beautiful about, like, what it is that is lost when a life is taken away, when it is bombed, right? Like, otherwise, like, why would we care about bombing and death if not for there's something, like, deeply valuable about the thing that's, like, taken away? And, like, the thing that is so beautiful about the book is that it's so attentive to, like, what is beautiful about being, like, a human. So, like, do you think about that when you're also thinking about making yourself suffer, or, like, the reader suffer?
I mean, I was talking about the book in terms of reparation, right? Mm-hmm. In terms of fixing something that is broken. Mm-hmm. And so there was a project there I wanted to allow this character, I spent a chapter watching him bathe, right? Mm-hmm. I spent like 5 pages watching him shit.
Yeah.
Right? I wanted to give him the dignity of these moments. Mm-hmm. The dignity that he would not have had in real life. I talked about it in terms of a fictive reparation, right? I was trying to give this man a certain kind of solace from the clockwork shelling that he probably would not have had, and so I wanted to make it. I did need to give him that beauty. Yeah.
Hello, I'm also really excited to be here. I just thank you for your books. They really opened up like a possibility of different types of fiction writing for me. So yeah, I'm really interested in what you said about kind of being averse to the kind of philosophy statements and analytical philosophy and kind of writing for the philosophical mood or like the vibe. And your books are definitely very vibey. But then you also talked about guilt and you talked about reparations, and I'm hearing kind of like a philosophy of ethics a little bit. And so I'm curious, like, as you're writing a novel, do you feel satisfied to end it once you feel like you've sustained the mood to kind of like a certain momentum? Or is it that by the end, the characters have actually gotten to a place that kind of reflects your thinking around ethics and guilt and what is deserved?
Thank you. I'm not exactly sure because I feel like each book ends up having to be different. What is a mood? It's something that this is how I think actually. So you ask this question, I ask myself, what is a mood? It's a thing that a mood is a state that conceals certain things in our environment and that makes certain things in our environment more salient. It forces us to see certain things and it blinds us to certain other things. And a book, a novel, educates us in a mood. It instills us in a mood. This is why, I don't write short stories. And part of the reason is that, you sit with a book, you lie with a book, you read a book on the train, you read a book for 5 minutes before class, you read a book 2 hours before you go to bed. You're with a book at all these different positions in your daily life over the course of, I'm a slow reader for generally at least 2 weeks. And when you're thinking of novels of mood, there are novels, that have unified, Samuel Beckett, Thomas Bernard, Clarice Lispector. These are novels in which mood doesn't really. We're experiencing we're exploring the logic of a mood, like what it shows and what it hides, and what that particular constellation of seeing and not seeing offers us as a way of life. We read the book. We're offered a way of seeing. And we stay with the book long enough for that to potentially become a possibility for us. That's a kind of, that's an ethical, that's an ethical pursuit, reading a novel in this way. You're reading it for what it allows, for what mood it might inculcate in you and what mood you might take away from it. So I do see those two things as, strongly connected, that the novel as a phenomenological project and the novel as an ethical project or personal ethical project. If that makes sense.
I think we have time for one more question. James.
You spoke very well about feeling some lack in philosophy that was fulfilled in fiction when you were young. And the question I had was whether you just talk for a minute more about that link. And specifically, you talked about the philosophers that you were reading as a youngster, but I wondered what the fiction writers were, if there were any, who led you in that direction away from philosophy and into the fictional fulfillment.
I came to reading fiction much later, after university, and it was, I had a very, let's say, charged experience reading The Man Without Qualities. the specific back and forth movement between, like direct experience and then reflection on experience that, like characterizes that book. It really there was Musil, then later there was, there have been the writers who are essayistic, who are philosophical, like almost explicitly so, Musil, Proust, there are a few. Peter Nadash, the Hungarian writer, is probably my favorite living writer, even though his books are somewhat uneven, just because of what he has shown him. Certain scenes have shown him, certain scenes of his have been, I've never been able to forget them. He's also a writer who is explicit. And then there are writers, as I said, of mood. And for me, like Beckett has been really important. The Central Asian writer Andrei Platonov has been very important. Thomas Bernard. Passage North is kind of, I don't know if is modeled on Extinction, which is divided into 2 parts: Telegram and then The Will. This book has 3 parts, but it's kind of modeled on that text. Writers who for me are like, offering, unlike I think Proust or Musil, those are writers that tend to move away, and they sometimes, they can offer you a kind of aerial view of life that the beauty of having experiences articulated that you haven't before, but that maybe doesn't give you anywhere to move on to. And then these writers of mood, as I call them, who offer deeper and deeper and more detailed or nuanced, like explorations of, I guess, single, like a single, let's say, mood or system of moods. And those are the two, I guess, those are the 2 sets of writers that, broadly speaking, really kind of move me to philosophy, move me to literature.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think that's
Thank
it.
you.